Yeah.
All right, there we go. It was a little hidden for me. They moved it around. All right. So with that, I appreciate the introduction, Isis, and very happy to talk about this topic. It's kind of funny because I love talking about money, and because I think it's productive to actually have conversations. If we don't talk about it, then there's less that we know. So hopefully you'll agree with me that I think learning more about compensation practices and how to make them more equitable for everyone is something that I think we can all get on board with. So hopefully by the end of this session today, you'll have a few ideas on how maybe you can go back to your own organization and make some small adjustments in some cases to really make significant change in terms of how people are obtaining equity and just making sure that we're all getting a better and level set experience when it comes to compensation, because it is a very difficult conversation to have, but it's also one of the first ones that you have when you're offered a position at a new organization. And then it has long term effects for your livelihood and everything else down the road. So, what I want to do today is begin with a brief discussion as to what pay equity is from our perspective, and then talk about the practices that contribute to pay inequity and also some of the situations that have resulted in society, specifically in the US, from long-standing historical practices. Also, personal decisions, I think, are a factor of kind of where we're at today, but additionally, recognize that there are social circumstances that contribute to our current inequities that exist in the US. We'll also talk about some legal implications, and although that's probably the meatier part of the session, because the law is the law, but I also believe it's important for us to know what our rights are as employees and as administrators of organizations, and also recognizing their limitations as well. So it's important for us to kind of have a full scoping of that. And then, of course, I do like to always give some ideas of actions to take. And in some cases, it's very small, easy to do. I can go do this right now once I, leave this call. Those type of actions. But then there's also some more complex where we have to do kind of a big deep dive analysis of what's going on in our organization. So, give you a mix of things to consider as you go back to your organizations and think about how you might use this information. So our first order of business, I would love for everyone to try out the annotation function. If you've not used it before, you can just hover over to the top of your screen. There should be a bar. It might say, Antonio is sharing a screen. Hover up there and bring down the menu. There should be a view options or more options button. Click on that, and then click on the annotate function. And if you can't find the annotate function for some reason, you can just pop it into the chat box. But I'd like you to put a stamp on the number that represents your current comfort level for discussing pay equity. And you can interpret that however you wish, but I'd like to know where you're at. 1 through 10, 1 being not so much, or I'm a pro at discussing pay equity. Awesome. And again, if you can't find the annotate function, you can just put your number into the chat box so we know where you're at. And as you're doing that, I just also want to acknowledge that today's going to be a very interactive session. So I like you to put your thoughts in the chat box, participate in annotate functions as much as possible. And then also we're going to have a couple, actually 2, I believe, small breakout groups that we want you to have some discussions in. So not surprising. I'm actually more surprised that there's not more people that have popped up a 1 on the screen, but I do appreciate you giving your honest opinion as to where you're at. And I'm actually also very happy to see that there's a couple of 8s. 8's a hard place to get to, in my experience as to this topic. There have been people I've worked with for almost 10 years that won't talk about compensation. And I think that sometimes that's a limiting aspect of how we can actually address certain inequities that might exist. So thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen. Poof. And believe it or not, we were going to dive right into well, let's start with a video before we go into discussion. I just want to maybe ground us in the concept of pay equity and also understanding how different groups and gaps are measured. So I'm going to start a video here, and I will move it back to the beginning. And if just give me a thumbs up or something in the chat box to let me know if you can hear the video, okay?
Today's workforce is becoming increasingly diverse, which in turn is drawing even more attention to pay equity. While half of the workforce is vulnerable to collecting a different paycheck solely due to factors outside their control, an additional crisis is taking place, and that is your employees' perceptions of pay gaps. You see, 1 in 3 employees believe there are pay gaps at their organization. This is partly because many organizations struggle to communicate about pay equity without feeling exposed to legal, brand, and reputational risk. It's also due to general confusion on the subject of pay equity itself. So let's start by clarifying the difference in the 2 types of pay equity gaps. Pay equity can refer to gaps between groups of employees, called group-to-group gaps. For example, there are more male doctors and more female nurses, so on average, men make more than women at a hospital. Pay equity gaps can also be present in role-to-role situations, such as a male nurse making more than a female nurse. Role-to-role gaps refers to 2 individuals who are doing the same job and should be paid the same but aren't, due to an identifying characteristic outside of their control. We know now that much of the confusion is due to media coverage on pay equity that conflates the 2 types of pay gaps, role-to-role and group-to-group. This, in turn, leads to a general misunderstanding on the subject and increases the negative perceptions that employees have toward their organization. Also, many organizations do not communicate effectively with employees on the subject of pay equity, often due to their lack of confidence in their progress. It's important to understand that misperceptions have unintended talent implications. Employees simply thinking that a pay gap exists has the same effect as an employee learning that they could make 30% more doing the exact same job at another organization. That means employees are 16% more likely to leave due to simply perceiving that a pay gap is taking place. For context, the negative effect of employees perceiving a pay gap is 50% worse than experiencing a pay freeze. So, not only do organizations need to help employees understand the different types of gaps, but they also need to communicate more openly about their pay equity efforts. When designing your action plan, consider the following questions about 3 key audiences. Have you defined what your organization means by pay equity and established an enterprise-wide plan for addressing it? Have you prepared managers to communicate with individuals who may be receiving equity adjustments? And finally, have you thought about validating and publicizing progress on equity outside your organization? The good news is that progressive organizations are well on their way to closing role-to-role gaps. But until they begin tackling employee misperceptions, there is still work to be done. To learn more about how CEB, now Gartner,
So I love this video because it's in a very simplistic way describing a very complex topic. So there's a lot of things that contribute to pay equity today. Some of them are actually, they make sense in a way. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But then there's other things that really don't make sense, and it's related to organizational functioning. It's related to actual discrimination and bias. And those are the types of things that we have more control over than I think we believe in some instances. So it's definitely important. Hopefully when you walk away from today's session, you'll have a better sense of just kind of how the current pay gaps have been portrayed historically. Also understanding there's layers beneath that still kind of hold true, and then others that don't. But then also that there are societal things that we have kind of grown accustomed to in terms of life choices and things like that that are a small portion of what the current pay gap is kind of resulting from. But then there's a whole host of other things that are really related to poor compensation practices that I think that's where we want to really focus our efforts on today and really get some tangible change here. So now that we have at least a very simplistic, grounded sense of pay inequity from that perspective, I also want you to kind of think about your own personal experience and thoughts related to this topic. I think that's important to also address. And one of the things in the video I think is probably the most important for me is talking about perception. And because perception is reality, and I know that this is true and this transcends a number of different topics in the organization, such as, do I feel like the organization treats me fairly? Do I feel like I have fair access to promotional opportunities? Do I feel like my compensation is fair? All of these questions are really grounded in my perception as to what is fair, what is equitable, and also comparing myself to other groups in the organization or other groups in some other space. So what I'd like us to spend just a brief 5 minutes discussing is, you know, did you know that a partial contributing factor to pay inequity is our social aversion to discussing pay? And I suspect some of us might be more comfortable talking about pay and specifically our pay and with other colleagues. But in general, specifically in the US, again, I'll keep referring to the US context, our propensity or comfort level discussing compensation is very low. And I think that's part of the contributing factor of inequities because we don't really have all the information we need to determine, am I getting paid appropriately? So I want to spend a little bit of time in small groups talking about that. But also, why do you believe it is difficult for most people to talk about salary? Why don't we discuss it if we know it can help level the playing field? And then what might need to change or what might need to reform, whether it's our own personal perceptions, whether it's organizational policy, is it federal policy, whatever you think it is. I'd love to know what your ideas are on how we can change this. So the gist is, and I'll put these question prompts in the chat box just so you have them there. But I want to spend 5 minutes just kind of think about why do we have this aversion to discussing compensation, and then what can we potentially do about it to become more comfortable, to become more competent in discussing this. So I'll create randomized groups of 3, and then again 5 minutes. I don't think this will take too long for us to kind of get to an answer here. But I'll see you back here in about 5 minutes, and definitely if I probably will pop into some of the rooms just to make sure we're good. But questions are in the chat box, the prompts, so you know what to discuss. And then 5 minutes. I'll see you back. You should all be receiving an invite to join your breakout room now. see. So it looks like we're all back. So what did we learn? Feel free to unmute yourself and just share maybe some of the more important parts that you discussed with your group. What was your takeaway from that conversation? Or feel free to type into the chat box, whichever you're more comfortable with.
Good morning, this is Karina. Kimberly and I actually had a really great conversation around this. I think it's interesting that ethnicity plays a part into the comfort level of being able to have the conversation about pay inequity and feeling like how you were brought up and brought up either talking about finances or brought up not talking about finances really plays a part into your comfort level and having those conversations. I think when we're talking about this, and I think the biggest difficulty I know for me right now, because I just had to have this major conversation with my board about salaries with my agency, is we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we're talking about giving people increases that are so well deserved and needed because we need to be paying them equitably. But we're looking at paying them equitably in the middle of a pandemic and a crisis. So I think there's a lot of things that play into this, and I think the norm needs to be people being comfortable having the conversation and knowing they have to be an advocate for their employees and they have to be an advocate for themselves and know that they're worth what they're asking for.
I agree 100% with everything you just said. That, and it's a tricky thing, right? In that some people are less prone or keen to be their own advocates just because of cultural norms. I definitely can say there are certain cultures in particular that they're more deferent, right? We trust and leadership will take care of us. And unfortunately in American culture, that's like actually the opposite of what we need to do. So there are definitely some hurdles there. Are there any other thoughts from the rest of the group? I definitely heard some great comments when I was popping into the updates.
I think Carolyn's looking to share. Carolyn, I think you're muted though.
Okay.
All right. One of the things that I did bring to discussion this morning is we talked about some inequities occurring whenever you have people who are in various senior levels of employment who are working, doing the same job, but they actually have varying times on the job. That is not an issue for us in my nonprofit. Each individual that we have who works for us, their job is unique to them. And so there is no opportunity for them to make comparisons of pay there. I also do want to agree with Karina, though. I've most recently had a discussion with my board of directors in regards to salaries and increases. And because this has been such a trying year for all of us, I was able to convince them. As a matter of fact, my board president sort of led the charge with this for me, that we've been on the front lines trying to provide these services at the same level that we were doing prior to the pandemic. And so there definitely is a need for us to be recognized for that effort. And the end result of that was a higher level of pay increases this time than we have gotten in the past.
That's phenomenal and so great and definitely needed. I think a lot of people are in that situation where they've been on the front lines the entire time, and they're providing services. They're literally risking their health in some cases to do so. And those people, I think, are definitely underpaid. And you can think about a number of other people like teachers and healthcare workers who probably also are in a similar situation. But I think of most groups, unfortunately, won't have the benefit of having advocates like you. And that's a big issue for us. And so I appreciate you all sharing. And I'm sure we could probably sit here all day and converse about this, but I definitely want to dig into some other conversations and some other topics. So we'll carry on here. And I think it's also important for us to define pay equity specifically as we're trying to conceptualize what it is and how do we achieve it. And I think this definition from SHRM is helpful and also some ways a little bit nebulous because there's a kind of a gray area of a benchmark. But according to SHRM, pay equity is compensating employees the same when they perform the same or similar job duties while accounting for other factors such as experience level, job performance, and tenure with the employer. And so I think the one factor of this that's nebulous is, how do you capture experience and job performance and tenure and then translate that into dollars and cents? I feel like those benchmarks are obviously, we can definitely measure, how much experience someone has, how many years they've been with the organization. We can measure their performance if we have good performance measurement systems, but how does that convert into dollars and cents? I think that's where it's a little bit unclear. And something else that I think is important to think about is just a definition in general of what equity is. And a definition that we often use specific to just general equity across all spectrums is that it is the guarantee of fair treatment, access, and opportunity for all where individuals are not at a disadvantage because of their background or social position. Equity requires eliminating the institutional, systemic, and societal barriers that have prevented full participation of certain groups and developing solutions that are relevant to social structures, trends, and emerging opportunities. And while in some ways this is also a nebulous definition, I also think it gets us a little bit closer to understanding that if we're trying to achieve pay equity, sometimes we have to also rectify a circumstance that is outside of the organization or ignore it completely to actually achieve equity. And there's an example here. I usually use this graphic when we're talking about diversity and inclusion as it relates to interpersonal relations, but I also think it makes a lot of sense too when you think about pay. And so in this example, I want you to imagine that the apple that everyone is reaching for to be the same salary. Let's say it's $50,000. Let's also assume that all 6 of these people in the picture are equally qualified to perform a job. And they're all 6 doing the same job. They're all brand new employees. But the interesting thing is that they're each getting paid a little bit different based off of their circumstances. And these are common circumstances that I think many employees or employers still take into consideration as they're paying. So first example, let's think about what I just said. So all of them are qualified. They're all kind of going after the same job. And the apple is $50,000 salary. Interestingly, the person on the far left that's grabbing the apple was previously making $45,000 at a former employer. This person used that as a negotiation point to ask for a small $5,000 increase to take on this new job. That person obviously was able to make us an easy case. I was already making pretty close to this amount, so coming here, I need some type of incentive, and that would be $5,000 salary increase. And so that person was able to achieve the $50,000 salary. The second person, on the other hand, actually asked for $55,000, but was not a strong negotiator and was counteroffered $45,000 and accepted it. It was more than the $40,000 that they were making at their former job, so for them, it was still a nice bump up. And the third person actually lost their job back in March and has been out of work ever since. Since we're in a pandemic and bills are coming due, this person needs an income. They accepted the first offer of $40,000 without a second thought, even though just a few months ago, they were making $55,000 doing the same job somewhere else. And while these are fictional scenarios, they are real in terms of experience and what actually happens. Employers will oftentimes take into consideration work gaps, which are, I believe, irrelevant in the pandemic. The world has changed. The second thing they'll take into consideration, which I again think is wrong, is how much were you previously making at your former employer? And that's problematic in the longer term scheme, in that if you were underpaid at your former employer, why should that continuously impact the rest of your life as you work for other organizations? So I believe these types of data points are irrelevant to how we should be thinking about pay. So what I would propose is is a different compensation philosophy, one that publishes salary ranges, one that offers paid incoming employees that is equitable to current employees and is fair in relationship to the job being done. That is equity regardless of an individual's circumstances. They are paid an equitable wage in relation to anyone else who might be seeking employment or currently employed by the organization. And unfortunately, that's not the case today for many, many people. And the data, I think, behind the gaps and visualizing that is important. So I'll definitely show a few of these. I won't belabor them. I think most of us on this call are aware that yes, certain groups are definitely receiving less money overall. And the way this particular gap is measured is really looking at kind of total money earned by the various groups, and they divide it by however many people are in that group with that particular dollar amount. And so what we find is that when we slice the data a few different ways, the most widely known and publicized gap is specifically related to gender. And we find that white men, specifically, when we also overlay ethnicity and race, are kind of setting the benchmark as to who's getting paid the most in society in America. The second thing that we find is when we overlay race and gender for everyone else, there are certain groups that are making well below that. And so Hispanic, Latino women, people overall, specifically women, making almost half in terms of what men are making. And there's a question here, in government jobs where pay grades are transparent or rigid, is there more pay equity? I would say there's a higher propensity for pay equity. The thing that happens in government jobs is individual bias, right? How do I measure performance? How do we determine someone is going to get promoted and move on to the next level? I think that's still where some potential bias and things creep in. But from a standpoint of if I'm a grade E5 or however the grades go in the government jobs, at least I know that my colleague is paid pretty similar to me. The question becomes more so in that space is, are promotions dealt out in a way that's equitable? That would be kind of a parallel conversation related to compensation because it does directly impact compensation. But so it's really a question of, are those other processes functioning as they should when we got the salary bands kind of locked in? So I think that's a great point, Julia. It's a little bit different situation for government jobs, but it's still potentially, there's other places that we might want to pay attention to just to make sure that they're working correctly. So we know women are paid less overall than men. And that kind of transcends a bunch of different things. And this is the problem though. So if I'm getting paid, let's just say, the dollar amount here translates to $60,000 in annual salary for a white male. That converts to 49,000 or so for the average woman. And if you compound that gap over 30 years, it's about a $324,000 difference over a 30-year period, not accounting for wage increases, which further make that a larger amount. Because if you think about, if we both get a 5% increase on 60,000, I get a 5% on 49,000. That dollar amount is less for $49,000, right? That's just how the math works. So over time, that gap widens more and more. But even if I don't take that into consideration, you can literally buy a really nice house in most parts of the country with the amount of money that is discrepant between the two groups. And that's a problem. If we look at other slices, we look at men on the other hand, when we talk about the pay gap with women, well, interestingly, when we overlay race and ethnicity again onto gender, even for men, it still holds true. Black men make the least out of all racial and ethnic groups in the U.S. But probably the interesting stat is that Asian men, which make up a small population or a small percentage of the U.S. population, actually make more than white men. So it's kind of a bizarre phenomenon in some ways, but what we can consistently prove is that minority groups, specifically historical minority groups in the U.S., are having different experiences, most of them negative. In this one instance, we can show that there's a group, very, very small, probably one of the smallest in the U.S., is actually getting a positive outcome. And I believe that's driven up due to who is actually coming to the US and inflating that number. It's multimillionaire investors, heads of tech companies. The executive CEO of Zoom, as an example, probably would qualify in that particular bucket. So as you can imagine, billionaires definitely inflate the wage gap here calculation, and they're a very, very small group. So although that's the data, and I do like to present the data as it is, I think there's some reasons as that we can very clearly explain what's happening there. And then if we assume, Native American men and Black men, why they're making 9 to 13% less than their white male counterparts, that's a lot of money over time. And although we're looking at it in terms of a dollar amount, if you multiply it and say white men is making $100,000, well, that Black man is making 87 for doing similar work potentially. And the gaps don't just kind of live in the race and gender realms. They transcend a number of different dimensions of diversity. So people with disabilities, as an example, when we look at just full-time year-round workers that have a disability, they earn about 87 cents on the dollar for those compared to those people that do not have a disability. Another interesting thing here was, when we account for people doing similar jobs and similar work, some of that discrepancy goes away. And the reason why that is for this particular group, because they all operate a little bit differently, is that disabilities actually in some cases are very pervasive, and they limit an individual's ability to perform certain types of work at the same level as a person that doesn't have disabilities. And this is irrespective of being offered a reasonable accommodation. Sometimes a practical or reasonable accommodation doesn't exist. And so I like to think about the example, my oldest daughter, she has Down syndrome. There's possibly a limit on the types of work she'll be able to do when she gets older. Not that she can't hold a job and perform very well. It's just that her physical cognitive ability place a particular limit on the types of work she can do. And so I think that's true of people with disabilities, in that certain jobs are just inaccessible to them because of their life circumstance. And so that when we carve those groups out, what's left is something still very interesting. So although disabilities can limit the opportunities for some people, when we look at a couple of different areas, the pay gaps remain consistent. And they are specifically when people have disabilities and are also chief executives, when they're lawyers, when they're marketing and sales managers, and when they're financial analysts. And I can't necessarily say as to why that is, but I can tell you that when we account for people doing similar work, working a similar amount of hours, people with disabilities are paid less in those particular realms. And that's, again, more than likely due to organizational practices than anything else, because these are people that have, again, likely similar education, because if we cut people with disabilities and overlay education, they also make substantially less, probably in some cases 20% or more, in terms of a difference. But as you can see, even with other groups in the US, there's still measurable, observable pay gaps, even when we're accounting for a bunch of different things. And so we're left with a question as to, if we're trying to address any pay gap, it might be important for us to look not just at the individual dimension of diversity, but also looking across multiple groups and the compounded impact of who I am and what that means for my salary. So as an example, if I had to guess who the lowest paid person in America would be, it probably would be a Black woman who's also disabled, because all those intersectional groups are essentially limiting the ability for someone to both be perceived as being warranted an appropriate salary, but also all these other factors that we can measure and saying, historically, there's a bunch of other experiences in life, such as my initial job underpaid me, that follow me for the rest of my career in some cases, unless I'm able to break free of that. So I think a holistic view of all the intersectionalities of diversity and how those are negatively impacting someone's ability to receive equal pay, that's probably the more holistic view that we need to take as we're looking at this. But the reality is that similar phenomenon are happening for most marginalized groups in the U.S. when it comes to pay. They're not being paid at the same rate There's different reasons for that, and we'll talk about that next. But we can basically be here for the rest of the time and thinking about, okay, well, is this group paid differently, and why are the reasons for that? Although there might be subtle differences in reasons, for the most part, we find that there's a lot of similarities in terms of experiences and outcomes related to this topic. So I've broken up the, so why does this happen? What's contributing factor to pay discrepancy? And I group these first into logical and then what I would call concerning factors. And the logical factors are ones that I believe are due to life circumstance, that sometimes it's personal decisions, sometimes it's a reality of a sector. And most of these things are, I believe, are pretty well known to most people, and sometimes not. And that's an assumption that I'm willing to challenge too. But I bucket these first group of contributors as things that I think from my vantage point, they make sense, right? So let's start digging into them. So the first factor that contributes to some of the pay discrepancy or gaps is differences in jobs or industry work. So if we're looking at the total discrepancy of men versus women as an example, that's a fact. There's less resources being given to women versus men. But the other reason that kind of contributes to this is that if we look at who's going to what types of jobs and what industries, that directly impacts your expected salary, as an example. So me being an IO psychologist, as an example, there's a certain median income that's typically associated with being an IO psychologist. If I were to chose to be a pipe fitter, that would have been a different kind of general expectation. If I were chosen to be a physician, that would have been a different expectation. If I would have chosen to be a high school educator, that's a different expectation. So some of those choices, I do believe, are part of the factor. And we know that historically, men and women, there are certain sectors and industries that we see more of one group or the other. And as an example, jobs that have historically had female workforces include public education, home health aides, social workers. All of these positions, in terms of overall and general pay, are a little bit under the average overall. And we know that teachers are grossly underpaid, but still people choose every year to go and pursue that profession. So part of that is to some degree a personal choice. The other part is that there's some broken things in those sectors, right? And we know that certain sectors are underpaying their people. Men, on the other hand, if we're kind of making gendered norms or assumptions here, men might choose jobs like construction. Men might choose jobs like engineering or finance. And those industries are still kind of leaning heavily towards more male dominance in terms of who currently exists or chooses to go after those jobs. And interestingly, those are often paying average or slightly above average salaries. So part of this is just kind of where we pursue and where we end up. Another interesting one is the nonprofit sector overall. So we're all essentially nonprofit professionals. I've been a nonprofit professional for over 10 years, and I know for a fact, we're grossly underpaid. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics actually put out a few years ago, and they said that the average nonprofit professional is making about $3 less per hour than their counterparts doing pretty much the exact same job in the for-profit sector. Once you account for differences in benefits, such as additional perks and incentives that you might get, a lot of nonprofit professionals don't get bonuses, as an example. That difference moves up to a little over $4.50 per hour. And if you want to do the calculation, I've done the quick math, the crude math. If we estimate we work about 2,000 hours in a year, that's about $6,000 to $9,000 difference in a year for doing almost the exact same job, but just in a different sector. And surprisingly, again, women make up a significant majority of the nonprofit sector. So by de facto of just us being where we're at, we're getting paid less than what we would be paid if we were in the for-profit sector. And I would say this is partially a social norm, right? We have in society grown accustomed to the fact that, okay, well, it's a nonprofit, it's a mission service organization. we can pay people less. And I don't know if that's correct. I think that's probably the space that we need to challenge. And in some ways, I believe these gendered and racial and ethnic differences in pay are also society's issues. And so we need things to think about things a little bit bigger and to really solve for these problems systemically. And that's potentially outside of our individual control. But I do want to acknowledge that we may need to think about things like reform of public education pay. As an example, we may also need to think differently about how we expose youth to more types of professions and ensuring that we're not building preconceptions and gendered norms into their lives early on, because that can be a limiting situation, right? If we encourage someone to become a teacher, if we encourage someone to become a nurse, if we encourage someone to become a police officer, whatever it is we're encouraging them to do, is that gendered in terms of who's in those industries, and are we basically setting our children up to perpetuate those types of norms and over and over again? And interestingly too, on this topic, and I ramble a lot, but I feel like it's worth mentioning. I do think there's one positive experience that has resulted from the pandemic for some professionals, and I'll use my example as a situation. Prior to the pandemic, I used to work downtown in Chicago, which meant I had a 2-hour commute each way. I would leave the house at 7 a.m. I'd get back at 7 p.m. and my children were never really seen. And that's not even including the times where I had to travel for work. So there's a lot of time away from home that I used to really have. And the positive benefit of the pandemic, which you can say there's very few of those, is now my children have the vision of me working from home as a consultant. They would have never experienced that. And so if you have a similar experience where you're able to work remotely now, I know there's additional stress, right? I have 3 children. There's e-learning. There's all kinds of things happening. The dog is barking, whatever is going on. But now there is a positive aspect of I'm implanting this idea in their mind of what work looks like. And it's very different than anything I've ever experienced in my lifetime, right? I could have never imagined this would be the reality. And so I think the more that we think about exposing children and young adults to different types of professions and different realities and possibilities, that could potentially help us move some of this. But again, these are really, really big issues. And I promise you there's other things that we have much more control over that we can talk about. Something else that's been observed is different years of experience. And again, it kind of makes sense to a degree. It just depends on the circumstance and the actual details. But what we know for sure is that women are disproportionately forced out of the workforce to accommodate caregiving and other unpaid obligations, much more so than men. And part of the reason is organizational in nature, is that there's less prevalence of paid family and medical leave programs, which makes women less likely to return to work or just delay returning to work, right? If I have a new addition to the family or an elderly parent gets sick, a lot of the times that burden is taken over and overseen by women. And the reality is that very few employers, less than 20%, actually have paid family leave programs through as an employer. And only about 40% have access or present short-term disability insurance to help with costs and things should something happen. Not even to mention the fact that childcare is so expensive. I remember talking with a colleague in Washington State who spends more on childcare monthly than I do on my mortgage. I couldn't even imagine that type of cost. It would probably bankrupt me. And so fortunately for them, they can afford that. But the reality for most people is childcare is so prohibitively expensive that if you're not making more than $40,000 a year, it's probably more cost effective for you to stay home and watch your children and be with them. And that's a problem. That's a problem for us. Other, again, interesting differences. And I think this is why it's logical. If you leave the workforce for a couple of years to raise your children or to do something or whatever it is you need to handle, you come back, now you're 2 years behind. So if you're paid less based off of experience, I think in some ways you can justify that, but there's still opportunity for us to change as organizations and what benefits we provide to help people come back to work sooner, because I believe most of the workforce wants to work. The other thing I thought was interesting is that there's actual a measurement of differences in hours worked. And for whatever reason, men and women overall, as an average, men tend to work more hours by a notable amount. Part of the understanding as to why that is that, again, a lot of the family burdens often fall on women, right? If you think about yourself, maybe this is your circumstance where you work all day and you have to go home and do some homework with the kids or something, or maybe you have to cook dinner, maybe you have to do who knows what, you have to go take care of your parents. All of these things, most often from a society standpoint, seem to always be burdening women. And I believe that's probably the key contributor to differences in hours worked is just, if you're not at work working more, then you're working less. And that can potentially could directly contribute to overtime hours if you're an hourly worker, or visually speaking, sometimes measurement of performance is, do I see you in your seat working more frequently? And sometimes that's how performance and promotions are dealt out, which is a problem still. I think that is definitely an area of opportunity, but the measurement of hours worked, we can understand that that makes sense. And if that's a contributing factor to the pay discrepancy, I'm less concerned about that than some of these other things, to be honest with you. So as an example, now this is my list of concerning contributors to disparities, and it's a little bit longer. The first one is not having documented compensation practices. And this is pretty straightforward here. If you don't have policies and practices and laid out, this is how we pay people. This is how you get promoted. This is how we distribute pay increases. If you don't have anything written, no programs or policies or compensation philosophy, there's nothing to follow. And then how are decisions made? Well, the reality is with bias. And we'll talk about the types of biases that impact pay and compensation, whether it's what I might offer you initially when you come to an organization, or how I might assess your performance based off of my personal feelings towards you. But if there's nothing in terms of guardrails as to how we operate, then there's significant room for bias. And that to me is problematic. And that's definitely something that we can address from an organizational standpoint. We can put into place salary bands for certain positions. We can put into place a compensation philosophy. We can put into place a compensation plan. But if there's nothing there, that causes so many potential issues that we could even potentially have a hard time measuring them. So I would ask, what do you think, and feel free to type this in the chat box, what do you think is the largest root cause of negative perceptions related to pay inequity? I'll ask that again. What do you think is the largest root cause of negative perceptions related to pay inequity? Type your thoughts in the box, and I'll ask it one more time because it's kind of a complex question. What do you think is the largest root cause of negative perceptions of pay inequity? I'll give you a second to type that into the chat box. I'm curious to see what you're thinking. Lack of consistent, reliable information, communication. It's a good one, Julia. What else? What are others' thoughts on this? What contributes to negative perceptions on pay equity? Lack of transparency. Yeah, not surprising. Lack of transparency related to pay processes. So hopefully we're all on the same length, but what people think versus what they know due to lack of communication, transparency. That's it. You got it perfectly right on the nail's head, so to speak. So if we have processes, but we don't really communicate them and show people how they actually operate, that's a problem. Lack of knowledge or biases, absolutely. And so most organizations today are still keeping their pay processes a secret from employees, and I don't know why. Most likely there's probably something wrong with it, is the root issue. But let's consider a few items. So for example, if I were to ask your employees at your organization to tell us things such as, what are the criteria for getting a raise or a promotion? How are you paid compared to workers in similar roles within your organization? How are you paid compared to others in a similar role outside of the organization? What is the pay range for the ceiling for your current role? Would they be able to answer these questions? Might we be embarrassed at their responses or lack of information that they have? I mean, if employees don't know some of these are some of the basic stuff that I believe most of us should know. Like I should know my salary band for my position. I should know at least conceptually how others are paid in a similar position. I should at least have an idea of how I might be able to get a raise or a promotion. Is it something that I have to ask for? Is that written down somewhere? Is it something my supervisor will talk about with me during our performance reviews annually? Whatever that process is, we need to document it. And so if we have processes, a lack of transparency related to those processes is a huge organizational deficit because people will fill in the blanks in terms of, if I don't have this information, well, I'm going to look around the organization and make my own decision as to what's going on. So that's an area that we can control. Not adhering to policies is another one. And unfortunately, I've worked with a few organizations, specifically nonprofits, where there's a difference in what's written versus what happens in reality. And sometimes this is the fault of the executive director, as an example, because they are the senior most person. They control a lot of decision making. They might promote people based off of their own feelings and perceptions of what's happening. They might dole out pay raises or salary offers based off of however they're feeling. There's a lot of things that happen here, but basically there's a discrepancy between what's written and what's actually happening. And I've observed this in many, many organizations over the years. And sometimes it's in a specific team or department, right? There's one person that's maybe not following the letter of the policy. And maybe it's an organizational problem where nobody follows the policy. Like it's written and we know it's there, but we don't really do that. Another contributing factor is letting managers make decisions about pay without training them or providing them with the proper information. So there is a report actually that was put out by an organization called PayScale, and it's called their Compensation Best Practice Report. And they found that 60% of organizations don't provide compensation training to managers, even though most of them are responsible for communicating pay decisions. Now, this puts managers in a tough position because they might provide inaccurate information. They might make decisions that negatively impact their team or favor them excessively compared to others in the organization. But managers need to have an understanding of compensation philosophy and strategy. And they also need to be able to answer general questions about pay. This next one is an interesting one. And this goes specifically to the gender pay gap. And I'll explain that in a second here. But agreeable personality traits are a negative contributing factor for women in terms of achieving equitable pay. And while this finding may seem puzzling at first glance, what we have observed in the data is that more agreeable women have been found to be less likely to negotiate salary offers than men, less likely to ask for pay increases, and less likely to ask for promotions, all of which contribute to less pay. And so personality traits, being not dominant in terms of the culture of the workforce today, have a negative impact. And I think this is still something that we can control for in organizations. If we have more effective processes to say, okay, well, do we have a plan to check in with our staff, help them create career development plans, right? So as an example, have we actually had a conversation around what your long-term aspirations are? Maybe it's with this organization. Maybe you want to become a more senior staff person if that opportunity is available. Maybe you want to go somewhere else. I feel like having those conversations will allow people to clarify where they want to go. That way, the manager now has a little bit more ability to interject and say, hey, how are you making progress on this? At your next performance review, let's talk about things that we can do to expand your role and potentially get you a pay increase. If we're not having the conversation, we're leaving it more so on the employee, and the employee may not be equipped to have the conversation if they've not been experienced in doing so, or if they just don't want to rock the boat. They're happy to have a job and they're going to leave it at that. I still think there's room for us to do a little bit more as managers in making sure that our people are getting paid what they should be getting paid. And if they have more potential, we should foster that and cultivate it. The last area is direct. It's bias and discrimination. And this is, I would hope, probably a small portion of the pay inequities, whereas, it's illegal to do so. And since 1963, there's been formal pay legislation specifically related to gender. And we'll talk about some more legislation in a bit, but it's been illegal to discriminate and pay people less for a long time now, longer than I've been alive, unfortunately. So, and it's still a widespread practice, particularly for women of color, as we've already shown with some data. And beyond, explicit decisions to pay women less, employers may discriminate in pay when they rely on prior salary history and hiring, compensation decisions. This can be, essentially enable pay decisions that have been influenced by discrimination in the past, right? So if we're an organization that asks for pay history, and what'd you make at your former employer, and they experience discriminatory systems there, and we base our pay now on that, that's bias and discrimination inadvertently to some degree, but it's also a process that we're consciously taking on. So with bias, I do, I probably can do a whole 2-hour training on just that, but at a high level, there's 3 types of bias in particular I think about when I think about pay inequity and what influences it. And we'll take a 5-minute break right after this. So, but basically, affinity bias is an interesting one. So if I have a tendency to warm up to people like myself, that means I might be more inclined to hire people into good positions that work directly under me that I like. And if I'm hiring people that I like, then I'm going to probably hire people that are male and Hispanic, and that have similar interests in me, and that's a problem. And so I don't want to be hiring people that are like me. I want to hire people that are competent and can bring something unique to the organization. But our minds unconsciously move in that direction. And if we think about pay increases and promotion and things like that, if I'm only promoting people that look like me, that think like me, that's an area of discrepancy that will negatively impact all the other groups that don't fit into my affinity group. Similarly, when we think about the halo effect, which is the tendency to think everything about a person is good because we like them, if we think about performance review time, the annual salary increase, if my performance on the job directly impacts my pay increase, the more positive relationship I have with my supervisor or my manager, the better my chances are of getting a better increase than my colleague who doesn't. It has nothing to do with actual performance, right? It's my unconscious bias of mismeasuring performance. And so if we don't have really good performance measurement systems where there's a lot of rigidity, there's very clear, I completed 10 trainings and I did 50 intake meetings with clients, and I did A, B, and C. If it's not clear and direct and measurable in a very objective way, the possibility of halo effect comes into play. And for some people, that's a positive thing. But if you don't have a phenomenal relationship with your manager, this could be neutral or negative to you. And then perception bias is potentially both, more so on the hiring side of, if I have in my mind, who would typically fit in this type of job? Is it a man? Is it a woman? Whatever it is, right? So if I'm hiring for an administrative assistant role, who might I typically envision in that role? Well, the stereotype is it's a middle-aged white woman. And just to kind of be blunt about it. And that's a perception bias. The same way perception bias as to, I'm going to go hire a construction worker. Picture in your mind probably came up with a first of a man. And on and on. We have these perception biases as to people that fit into certain types of groups, in certain types of work. And sometimes, again, without more objective means of decision making, such as structured interview questions and a rubric to match those, to assess, does this person have the competency, knowledge, and experience to do the work? My perception bias potentially might come into play. And so these are just 3 examples. There's probably others that we can dig into, but perception bias, whenever there's a lack of structure information, there's room for biases to come into play, and whether deciding on a hiring decision, deciding objectively assessing performance or what have you. So what we want to do is create more processes and clarity in processes and communicate about processes to correct the instance and potential for any bias and discrimination to happen as it relates to how we're operating within our organizations. So with that, I know I've been talking quite a bit. I think it's a good time for you to take a 5-minute stretch or grab a drink break, grab a snack before we come back and dig into some of the rest of the content. And so I will see you back here at, let's see, East Coast time, let's do 10:17, 10:18, do 5 minutes. So I will see you back here at 10:17. All right, so a lot of information coming at you. I have a little bit more I want to share before we kind of take a little break to discuss some of it as a group. But the next topic that I want to talk about is legal considerations. And as I mentioned previously, there are laws. What are they? So at this point, you know, it's definitely an opportunity to just kind of maybe get reacquainted with some of them if we're not familiar with them. So in particular, as relates to pay, there are 5 specific laws that I believe are important in terms of just understanding what they do, how they operate, why they exist. So there's the Equal Pay Act, the Title VII in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There is the Age Discrimination Act, as well as the American Disabilities Act. And then the most recent one, which is about 13 years ago, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. Now, I'll kind of summarize these all here in a bit, but the gist of each one will hopefully be something that you at least take away as like, at least I understand a little bit what these are, because the legal language can be very off-putting if you're not a person that has a political science background, because it's very dense language, unfortunately. I feel like that's part of the problem with federal law and things like that, even still today. So the Equal Pay Act, which is the first one on the list here, is actually the first piece of modern civil rights legislation, but it's very narrow in focus, and it basically only prohibits pay discrimination based on gender, nothing else. And the act prohibits employers from paying women less than men for doing the same or substantially the same job at the same facility. So it's very specific. So that means if you worked out of different offices, probably wouldn't qualify as a claim under Equal Pay Act, even if it was within the same organization. Under the EPA, though, the claimant would only need to demonstrate that employer pays men more than women, without providing or proving that there is intentional discriminatory intent. So that's kind of a nice thing about the EPA law. But basically, an employer can defend themselves really, really easily, which is what the major problem is and why there's so much legislation after the fact. So as an example, if an employer could justify paying people differently based off of a seniority system that rewards people based off of their length of employment, which that kind of still perpetuates today in terms of tenure and us rewarding people just kind of for being here for a long period of time. Or if they have a merit system that rewards people for extraordinary job performance, or if you have poor performance management process, this is potentially problematic for the employee, right? If I can basically prove in court that your performance was poor, and I assess that in a very loose way, that technically still would allow the employer to skate away with some type of discrepancy in pay, unfortunately. So process becomes very important here. Another way an employer might get away with discriminatory processes is that if an incentive system that pays employees based off of the quality of their work or the amount of work they perform is in play, then the employer could, again, however they measure that, they can essentially justify pay discrepancies. Another factor related to job performance or business operations, such as paying a shift differential to workers on less popular shifts. So if you think about the concept of the graveyard shift, so to speak, right? Those really late into the early morning hour shifts where most people typically don't want to work those, you can justify paying people more on those shifts. Now, the problem is it doesn't really go deeper into who gets those opportunities. What if I want to be paid more and I'm willing to take these less desirable shifts because I don't really care, I just want more money? Well, that becomes an access kind of barrier, right? And who makes those decisions? And that's potentially where bias and inequity can come into play, because there's likely no formal distinction or program that says who gets what assignment. So the reality is although the Equal Pay Act, it does provide some guardrails as to what shouldn't happen. There's a lot of ways that employers can kind of get away from having to take responsibility for potentially discriminatory practices. And with that being said, there's not a ton of cases that are usually filed in relation to the Equal Pay Act. There's probably less than 1,000 per year in terms of cases filed, and out of those cases, probably only a small percentage actually get it all the way to the finish line, because as you might be aware, it's very expensive in terms of pursuing that, and then also, especially when it comes to big corporations, if they have the money to spend on lawyers, they can drag it out for years, and sometimes people just aren't interested in that kind of endeavor, because it really is a long-term commitment that can drag on for a long time, and probably longer than you're interested in dealing with it. So that's the Equal Pay Act. It's somewhat helpful, but not as helpful, I would say, as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, as some like to call it. And this is basically a comprehensive federal law that prohibits discrimination in all aspects of employment, including compensation based on race, color, religion, national origin, and gender. So it actually is like Equal Pay Act on steroids, so to speak, but also covers lots of other types of discrimination as well. So it's actually one of the cornerstones of legal protections today. And according to the EEOC, compensation discrimination on the basis of gender or sex in violation of Title VII, although is pretty good, it does not necessarily constitute violations of the Equal Pay Act. So it's basically addressing some of the deficits of the Equal Pay Act. And the nice thing about Title VII is that you're not limited to just claims of unequal pay for equal work. Compensation in violation of Title VII can be proven even if no member of an opposite class holds an equal or higher paying job. Comparisons can be made between similarly situated employees. All right, so one person gave the example of, we don't have the same job, right? Everyone in the organization is doing their own unique job. But is there a way to compare these jobs? Right, so let's say I'm a program administrator and another person is a financial administrator. Are these similarly situated jobs that I can compare that are at the same level in your organization? Maybe they're doing slightly different work, but it's a similar enough in terms of maybe qualifications or expectations of busy work that they might do that overlaps. So it gives a little bit more room to determine, okay, well, is there something that's happening here that's inequitable? And even though we don't have the exact same job happening, are there other ways to look at it? Something that Title VII does not cover is paying people different based off of different locations. And this is an interesting one. So as an example, if I paid someone differently in Miami versus in Jacksonville, I could probably justify that because of cost of living. And so that's an area that gets gray, because sometimes it's not as clear as that. So maybe I'm paying the person in Jacksonville more than Miami. What are the reasons for that? So that's one of the gray areas of the Equal Pay Act, but definitely this one is the one you'll see more. And actually, I remember a larger nonprofit some years back that they literally got taken to the cleaners because of this particular law. And so I do believe in terms of protection, it's probably one of the best things that we have available to us, depending upon what your actual protected class is. Now, as we move forward in history, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act and the American with Disabilities Act basically are filling gaps with Title VII and the Civil Rights Act. So, those two groups weren't represented as protected classes, but now they are, which is a great thing. So basically, imagine Title VII and just extending all those same things to people that are over 40. That's specific about the Age Discrimination Act. So if you're over 40 and you're being discriminated against in terms of pay in comparison to other people in your organization, that potentially could help you out. Or if you have a disability and you're being discriminated against on that front, that law basically is like Title VII, and it adds you in. Let's see. The last one that I want to talk about, because there's something very unique about the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, that's important for us to know, both as employees and as employers, is that that particular act in 2007 made a very interesting change to how long an employee has to file a claim under Title VII or the ADEA or the ADA. And so the act basically says that each new paycheck that is tainted by a prior discriminatory pay act triggers a new EEOC filing period, meaning that if I was discriminated against 5 years ago by a manager, and the manager gave me a bad performance review, and I alleged that it was because of my gender, that subsequent every single paycheck that's tied to that decision for the rest of my tenure at that organization basically extends the time frame that I can file a lawsuit. So if I wait 5 years and I'm still getting paid, and that thing was never rectified from 5 years ago, I can go to court and say, you know what, such and such manager back in 2015, they gave me a bad performance review because they didn't like me, and I believe it's because of my race or ethnicity, or because I have a disability, or because I'm my age, or what have you. And you can actually win a case like that. And so that it's really interesting to consider, but also very important for us to recognize that if I go back and think about, right, the manager training as an example, if I do a poor job of training managers in making compensation decisions, that, because of this act, can have negative consequences to the organization in the future. So I just kind of want to draw that connection into, like, why does this make sense to me? Why do I care about these laws? That's the reason why. Now, the fun part. So I'd like you all to bring out your annotation function again. And remember, it's view options or click more options at the top of your screen. And I want you to put a check mark next to the things that you believe your organization is doing well. And these are this box, 12 boxes of things that pay equity focused organizations do, or something that you can observe that's happening. These are very positive things. And I'll describe each of them, but as you're thinking about each of them, put a check mark, a green check mark next to anything that you think your organization is doing well today. And maybe put an X, a red X next to something that needs some work. And so the first example on the top left, executive support for equity, we have to get our leadership on board. If our leadership is not supportive of equitable pay practices, and they're not communicating clearly as to how we pay, or how promotions are obtained, or what the salary bands are, that's a problem. And executive support and communication is really a key item. So as in my own organization, my nonprofit HR, our CEO actually had one of our biweekly calls. We spent 20 minutes talking about how you get promoted, what the criteria are, what the salary bands for the different types of jobs we have in our organization, and how you get promoted. And so that clarity, in just terms of, now I know if I want to get to the next level, what are the requirements? What are the salary ranges for people that are in my particular consultant role? That's clarity, and it's helpful. It gives me something to reference. So, another one is confronting cultural biases. Society, we have to confront biases that continue to negatively impact individuals and devalue their work, such as defining people to certain gender roles, or gendering roles when there's not a need to do so. So are we good as an organization confronting biases? Having transparent pay practices, it's kind of self-explanatory. Do you know how to get promoted? Do you know what salary bands are? Do you know, at least within a range, what other people in other positions in the organization are paid? Do you know how your performance impacts your salary? Do you know how salary offers are made? Is it made in an equitable way? If there's no transparent, if you answered to no to any of those, there's a lack of transparency. Acknowledging possible issues and taking care of them, pretty straightforward. Equitable PTO and leave policies. This is one I think probably has become more exasperated than in the past, because people need more time now to handle personal things, or they need more flexible schedules, or maybe I need to leave for a couple of weeks to handle something. Whatever the case is, I feel like a lot of organizations don't have great equitable PTO time policies. An example of one that could potentially be equitable is an unlimited policy. Some nonprofits are now adopting this. And although it's not for every organization, I think there's some buy-in that you have to get. Um, Finding the right amount of equitable pay time off is an important thing. And the question of where do boards fit in with these, I would probably um, group them in with executive support, because to a degree, the board, depending upon the nonprofit and how the board relationship is with the executive director, sometimes the board actually has a little bit more levers to pull, so to speak, in terms of limiting what an executive director or other senior leaders in a nonprofit might be able to do. So I would bucket them in there just for the purpose of this exercise. But I do agree, Julie, that's a great point in terms of the board does have a role in terms of ensuring that even the executive director is or the CEO is acting in a way that's in line with what the intentions are. Conducting an audit, if you've never conducted an audit of compensation before, that's probably a problem, right? Do you know if there's anything wrong right now? Have a third party look at your organization. Paying market salary for work. The nonprofits are notorious for underpaying people for market salary jobs. That's just, we know it, right? It's a sector-wide issue. It's not in every single case, but the majority of the time. We're probably all underpaid if we were to just transplant our job into a for-profit space. And so how do we bridge that equity? There's some rethinking there of how we obtain and distribute resources. But the key thing is just do your best to pay people what the job is worth. And that's where our benchmark we want to go. In some organizations, you have to set new benchmarks. So if you're thinking about, if I did a compensation analysis, and let's just say I'm a larger nonprofit, let's say we have 50 employees. If I can actually say, okay, well, there's actually a little bit of pay discrepancy here, and then I'm using the groups that are being underpaid in my benchmark as to what people are going to get paid, it drags it down. So maybe you need to rethink how you're setting benchmarks in your organization. Maybe you need to set a new benchmark based off of what the highest paid employee is in a particular group of jobs, and use that as where we aspire to move people up towards. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, but an equity-focused organization will determine, or at least question, are the benchmarks we're currently using the right ones? Do we need to adjust in the particular direction? And so I think keeping that on top of mind and questioning whether or not that's necessary. A very simple thing, bottom left corner, let's stop asking for a salary history. That really forces people to make a comparative determination of where someone was. Maybe they were underpaid. Maybe they took a job because they needed an income, right? This is that time in our lives where a lot of people are taking jobs because they need an income, not because they're being paid fairly, not because they're being paid equitably. They need money. And that's a reality. And that's been a reality for a long time. But I think the simple action of just removing that as a question from application processes and conversations around initial offers is a simple thing we can do today that solves a lot of downstream issues. Making equitable pay offers is also a practice that we need to get in line with and start doing a better job of. So let's stop trying to lowball people, and let's pay them what the job is worth in comparison to the experience they bring to the table, in comparison to what others in our organization currently make for that job, and in comparison to what other factors you're using to make the determination of what an equitable offer might be. The next item, again, this is the piece of cake one. Put a salary range on your job descriptions. If you post your job, put your salary in that job description so people know. If I make it through the process and I get to that final interview and I'm offered the job, conceptually, I should have an idea of what this job is worth. And don't waste your own time taking someone through the process and then realizing that you don't have enough salary to retain them. At the same time, don't waste their time in terms of them going through that same process with you. So being fair, being equitable, all you have to do is put those numbers on the bottom of the job description when you post it. And I would assume most of us do have a range, and we can publish that and recognize that somewhere in that range is where we hire people. The last item is building a compensation plan. I think there's another session that's potentially going to be specifically about this. So I won't dig too deeply in this, but if you don't have a plan for compensation, that's a problem. So based off of the responses here, it looks like transparency is an area of opportunity. Conducting an audit might be an area of opportunity. Building a compensation plan, opportunity. What's a good range for a salary range? 10K, I would say that's probably good. And if you think about realistically, if the actual job band, let's say, is from 40 to 60, which is probably common in certain circles, you're realistically going to hire somewhere close to 50 in most cases. A lot of times when we bring in new staff, we hire them closer to the midpoint or a little bit below the midpoint. So if you have a tighter range, 10,000, I think it's really helpful if realistically that's just where you're hiring at. So I think that's a great question to pose. So I would say my direct answer back to what is a good range is, what is the real range that you're potentially capable of hiring someone in at? Do you typically hire someone at the bottom of the range? As an example, like most organizations typically don't hire in at the bottom. Typically the bottom is for when people are promoted up and they want to get them to at least a significant difference in pay. That's where the bottom usually comes into play. But whatever that real range is, I think $10,000 is a fair range. There's some wiggle room there up and down. Is there a way to help frame the compensation discussion with boards as an investment in mission rather than an expense to minimize? Well, I mean, your people are your greatest asset, right? The work gets done by people. And if we're not hiring top tier talent, quality talent, we can't achieve the mission in a way that's effective. And how you retain top talent is by paying people what the jobs are worth. And I think it's really about getting them to reset their perceptions of, why do we pay people what we pay them? And the answer should always be, we pay them what we pay them because that's what the job is worth. And that's based off of their experience and their ability to do the job. So Julie, I think that's a great question. I think it's something that we need to, because we're also fighting their perceptions within the organizations that they potentially work for and what those compensation practices are and whether or not they're good or bad. So in some cases, it might be an uphill battle. But from a mission standpoint, if we can't pay our people adequately, that has downstream impacts on employee engagement. It has downstream impacts on their propensity to leave the organization. So if I'm just going to make a simple business case, if we pay people appropriately, they're less likely to leave. Less likely to leave means that saves us money because it's expensive to replace staff. So if I had to simplify the argument, I might do it in that way. But it's also understanding what your board's perspective and what their personal experiences are on the topic. Do you include the cost of the compensation plan as part of the range or separate salary for compensation and benefits? I think I'm not interpreting that question correctly, Karina. Maybe if you want to unmute and ask it.
Yeah, when I typed out, I'm like, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but when you're talking about giving a range of, salary, are you including, the cost of the compensation and benefits in that range, or are you separating out like this is the salary range and then in your additional compensation would be these benefits?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So I think it's best to separate them so that way you can still visualize, I'm paying $1,000 towards your benefit or your retirement or whatever ancillary things you're contributing, but then also allowing the employee to understand, like, this is my base salary, this is my actual dollars and cents that I'll be receiving and taking home, because that's most often what people are focused in on. So allowing them to be objective and know what that amount is. But I also believe there's a huge merit in also having people understand that all the additional things that they get in terms of benefits, perks, and incentives as a staff member of the organization. And that's, in my experience, right? I got hired into a job one time not knowing what the insurance was, not knowing what the retirement package was, not knowing a lot of things. All I knew was the base salary. And I felt very uneasy about it. I was like, did I just make a really bad decision? I don't even know if I'm going to be able to get good insurance. And my children have very specific needs. So I do believe there's a lot of merit in kind of dishing that out. because it gives you an opportunity to explain what the benefits are and also kind of build a better case of why an employee might really enjoy working for your organization, and also having a tangible way to say, this is all the additional resources that we're giving to you to help you be the best version of yourself within our organization. So I think it's a great question. In additional business case considerations, and Julia, this is probably the slide I should have pulled up for you. But to me, it's kind of simple in terms of my thought is that if we increase trust from our current and future employees, trust has a downstream impact to employee engagement, retention. In addition, the second one, it just allows it to be more efficient in recruitment and hiring processes. If we allow people to weed out themselves, if their salary expectations are beyond what we can offer them, it just makes it more efficient for us. We don't interview people that are outside of our range in most cases, and allows us to get to an agreement on something that works for both the organization and the employee. A third item that I didn't talk too much about is that it does give you more control and consistency in your budget. So back to Kimberly's question of, do I have a range? If it's $10,000 or whatever the range is, and I know for a fact I'm only going to hire in between there, that doesn't really mess up my budget too much, because I can kind of put a dollar amount. I can actually put the highest amount on that I might potentially hire a staff person in for bringing somebody new, and I'll be good on my budget. Right, so a little bit more control, consistency on the budget when we have a fixed and finite playing field when it comes to salary. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about is the relationship between diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that, if we do a good job there, right, if people feel like they're part of the organization, that we're welcoming them, that they can bring their full authentic selves to work, they're more likely to trust us. They're more likely to have sense of belonging and affiliation with the organization, which leads to engagement, which has direct outcomes related to performance. But we're also more likely to retain them. So good compensation, building trust, which can happen the very first transaction when someone comes to the organization, puts coins in the bucket, so to speak, in building trust and allowing these other positive downstream impacts to occur. Because if we start off on the wrong foot, we hire someone below our salary range or at the very bottom, and they come in the organization to somehow figure out that other people are getting paid more than them, we've essentially pulled coins out of the bucket, if we want to think about it in a different way. So in small groups, very briefly, I know we don't have much time left here, but I do want you to think about what we've talked about today. And I'm going to break it up into 3 groups of 3 or 4 again, and give you about 7 minutes. Well, let's do 5. Let's do 5 minutes, because I do want to give some time for additional questions. I'm sure you have some, but 5 minutes to talk about, do you believe your current pay practices are subject to bias at your organization? How does that look? What changes might you need to seek to implement more equity in your compensation? Thinking about today's workshop, some of the things we talked about, what can you take back to your organization and do to improve what's currently happening? What actions can you specifically take at your level of influence in your organization to improve pay equity practices in your organization? So 3 either simple or complex questions depending upon your vantage point, but I put them into the chat box. So just let us know in small groups. Let's talk about pay and equity. Is there something that maybe isn't working in your organization? What can we do about that based off of what we know now? And what will you do specifically? Okay. And I will hopefully get you new breakout rooms. There we go. And I will see you back here in 5 minutes. Should be getting your invites now. We'll just give folks another 30 seconds or so as the breakout rooms are closing. All right, it looks like we are all back. So I popped in to listen to some of the discussions. Great comments. I'm glad you're engaging on this topic. As we start off today, just a brief, short, almost 2 hours ago, we were grappling with the reality of this is sometimes a difficult space for us to have a conversation about. So I'm very happy to hear you thinking about it and how we might be able to improve some things back at your own organizations and thinking about that. That's widespread impact potentially for some of us. Um, but thinking about everything we've talked about today, thinking about the conversations you've had with your colleagues in the nonprofit space, what is something specific that you'll do differently now based on what we've talked about today? And feel free to just share from your own vantage point. If you want to pop it into the chat box, that works for me. Or if you want to mute yourself, feel free to do so. Or if you have questions, this is also
Antonio?
Yes.
Well, one of the things that Karina and Deidre and I were talking about is that the how important this training is. Myself being in the startup, I've only been incorporated for less than 6 months now. It was in June, and Karina being in an organization that she stepped into that has been in place for 20 years, and how it is so important to receive this information because with myself, it allows me to be able to understand, what I need to do at the jump and how I need to establish a foundation and build upon that as it relates to ensuring that I'm establishing policies and procedures and that is going to outline an equitable practices across the board. But on the other end, where she's stepping into an organization that has been in place for 20 plus years, it also allows her to be able to see and understand and then come along her side of her staff and making sure that she does revamp the various practices that are taking place. So though I don't have any changes or anything I need to implement currently, well, any changes, implementation, absolutely, because right now there is no staff outside of myself. And well, actually, I'm still a volunteer at this point. And it just allows us to be able to, to see it regardless of where you are within the organization or how long, let me say that. It makes a huge difference, this type of training. So very appreciative for you and the Nonprofit Association.
Well, definitely.
Nonprofit Center.
Denny, I also appreciate your perspective too, right? Because it's in a lot of the examples I gave were, okay, something probably isn't working right or it's not there. In your case, it's I can actually plan to put these things into place once we get to the point of needing them for other staff and things like that. So I appreciate that perspective, and I think it's very helpful. Other comments in the chat box, we're planning to push for our organization to have greater transparency and communication about practices. Appreciated the grid, glad the grid was helpful to you in thinking about all the types of actions and activities you might be able to do. Trying to get in front of bias by identifying tools to use to help set salary ranges and consult resources regularly to ensure fair pay. Excellent. Striving to have better communication with all staff regarding their satisfaction with compensation. Yeah, if we don't know what we don't ask, and the side consequence of that is if we ask, we need to be able to take action on that. So are there any other questions or commitments or thoughts you have after today's session? We have about 4
Antonio,
minutes.
I just want to thank you. But I have to say, working with the Nonprofit Center and being able to do trainings like this are so important. And I was telling Danita and Deirdre in our session, I just went through a lot of these issues with the board to talk about inequalities on how we're paying people based on a number of things. So this just kind of helped solidify that the conversation I had was the right one. But I'm really appreciative to the Nonprofit Center, because if it wasn't for the report that they put out and for the surveys that they do, I wouldn't have the data that I needed in order to have the conversation to show them where the inequities were in our pay and our pay scale. So everything that you guys do and this whole presentation was amazing. So thank you so much.
Excellent. We appreciate the feedback. All right. Isis, I think if there are no other questions, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. I am putting into the chat right now the survey for today's session before anyone hops off. And I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Before I do that, I just want to go ahead and give a virtual round of applause to Dr. Cortez for being here today and sharing his information, being so generous with his time. We can't give you a real round of applause, but I guess just imagine it that we are giving you one. So a few events that are coming up I want to touch on. I wanted to touch on specifically the next session around the compensation and benefits trainings. We're doing a CEO performance evaluation training on January 12th. Again, this is free and open to all nonprofits. This one's actually going to be led by our very own Rena Coughlin. And I also want to touch on implicit bias and equitable teams that is happening on February 23rd. That one I believe is $50 for members and $9 for non-members. I'm going to be sending information on these more in the follow-up email, as well as the recording from today's session. But with that being said, my contact information is here. Again, I'm adding it for any questions around programming, but also if anyone is interested in getting access to the full report, go ahead and send me an email and we can figure out whether or not your organization has free access to it, or if you'd have to pay, or if you would just like access to the executive summary for it. But with that being said, I think that's going to be it for today. And if anyone has any final questions, you can go ahead and put it in the chat as we hop off. But if that's it, I want to thank everyone for coming today and have a great rest of your day. Sorry, was I muted that whole time?
Nope, nope, you're good. Is there anything else you need from my side, Isis?
I think we're good. Actually, if you don't mind sending over the